On the third morning, the snow fell with the quiet cruelty of something that did not care who suffered beneath it. Blackthorn Station stood rigid beneath its iron ribs, breathing smoke and indifference into the pale winter air. Passengers moved with urgency, collars raised, boots sharp against the frost. None lingered. None hesitated. None belonged to the young woman standing alone beside the tracks. Her veil, once a promise, now hung torn and stiff with frozen tears. She did not shiver. She had learned already that some cold did not live in weather, but in memory at all anymore now. Eleanor Whitcomb had arrived as a bride, though no one here would remember her that way. The silk of her gown bore the bruises of travel and violence alike, its hem darkened by slush, its lace collar shadowed faintly by dried blood. She kept her spine straight because dignity, once surrendered, was never returned in full. 3 days ago, she had stepped from a carriage believing herself chosen. 3 days ago, she had believed vows could shelter a woman from loneliness. Now, even the station clock seemed to tick with accusation, counting each second she remained unwanted and publicly abandoned. They had not struck her where bruises could easily be displayed. Society preferred invisible injuries, the kind concealed beneath gloves and silence. Her husband's final words lingered more sharply than any hand. He had spoken them without raising his voice, without anger, which made them permanent. "You were never meant to be seen beside me." The sentence lived inside her now, repeating with each breath she drew. She wondered if love had ever been offered, or if she had mistaken politeness for promise. Around her, strangers passed without pausing, granting her the peculiar cruelty of being witnessed, yet never acknowledged. A porter had offered once to call her a carriage, but pity delivered publicly was its own humiliation. She had declined with gratitude, preserving the illusion that departure remained her choice. The truth was simpler. There was nowhere left to arrive. Her parents' last letter had returned unopened, the wax seal unbroken, their rejection more formal than any spoken insult. They feared contamination by her disgrace. Wealth insulated itself from inconvenient daughters. Eleanor understood this without resentment. Love, she had learned, was often conditional upon convenience. Still, she remained where she stood, guarding the belief that someone might yet come. The station itself seemed to observe her. Iron beams arched overhead like the ribs of some enormous creature, indifferent to the small heartbreak unfolding beneath. Steam curled and vanished, mimicking hope's endurance. Somewhere beyond the drifting white horizon lay estates filled with warmth, laughter, and certainty. She imagined candlelight reflected in polished mirrors, hands extended in welcome, names spoken with affection. Such places had once seemed reachable. Now, they belonged to another version of herself. A girl who had believed endurance was rewarded. Eleanor no longer believed in reward. She believed only in surviving the present hour without surrendering entirely. On the far edge of the platform, 2 noble women paused beneath a shared umbrella. Their jewels glittered with unnecessary brilliance, catching the weak winter sun as if competing with it. They spoke softly, yet cruelty required little volume. "That is the bride," one murmured. The other answered with delicate horror. "How dreadful! She looks as though she expected love." Their laughter followed, quiet and precise. Eleanor kept her gaze forward. Reaction would grant them power. Still, their words found their mark. Shame moved through her like frost through glass, invisible yet capable of shattering everything she had once believed secure. Hunger visited her in careful intervals, never violently, always with patient insistence. It reminded her that she remained human, despite society's efforts to redefine her otherwise. A boy passed carrying warm bread, the scent rich enough to awaken memories she wished to avoid. She remembered kitchens filled with morning light, her mother's distant approval, the comfort of belonging somewhere unquestioned. Those memories felt borrowed now. She pressed her gloved hands together, steadying herself. Survival required stillness. Motion invited collapse. If she remained upright, if she endured long enough, Perhaps dignity itself might return and claim her again someday soon. Late that afternoon, the wind shifted, carrying with it the distant thunder of approaching wheels. Carriages arrived often, yet something in the rhythm of this one commanded attention. It moved without haste, guided by authority rather than urgency. Conversations dimmed. Even the porter straightened unconsciously. The carriage bore a crest carved deep into black lacquer, a symbol recognized instantly by those who understood power. Ravenscroft. The name passed between whispers like forbidden prayer. Eleanor did not turn immediately. She had no reason to believe power concerned itself with her existence. Yet she felt, unmistakably, the sensation of being seen there. The carriage door did not open. No grand figure emerged to claim attention. Instead, stillness deepened, thick and deliberate. Frost traced fragile patterns across the carriage window, obscuring whoever waited inside. Eleanor told herself it did not matter. She had lived 3 days without rescue. She could endure a lifetime more. Yet something within her, something stubborn and dangerously hopeful, refused to remain silent. She lifted her eyes. Through the frost, she sensed presence rather than detail. It was enough. For the first time since her abandonment, she did not feel entirely alone beneath the indifferent winter sky tonight now. Minutes passed, measured only by breath and courage. Eleanor's strength faltered, exhaustion claiming what pride could no longer defend. Her knees weakened, and the world tilted gently, mercifully toward darkness. She did not resist. Falling felt like relief. As her vision dimmed, she wondered if disappearance might finally grant her peace. Then, from somewhere close, a child's voice pierced the quiet with innocent clarity. "Papa, why is the bride crying?" The question hung in the frozen air, fragile and irreversible. And within the silent carriage, someone shifted, as though her suffering had finally become impossible to ignore at last now. Warmth returned to Eleanor Whitcomb in fragments, not as comfort, but as interruption. Sensation crept into her fingers first, a cautious tingling that reminded her she still occupied a body capable of feeling. She did not open her eyes immediately. Consciousness itself felt like a negotiation she was unprepared to complete. The cold had been honest. It had demanded nothing except endurance. Warmth, however, implied intervention, and intervention implied witnesses. Her pride, though fragile, recoiled at the thought of being observed in weakness. Still, breath filled her lungs more easily now, and the scent of wool surrounded her. She opened her eyes to discover the source of that warmth draped carefully across her shoulders. The cloak was heavy, its fabric dense and unyielding, lined with dark velvet that retained heat with quiet authority. It did not belong to her. Nothing so deliberate could belong to someone so publicly discarded. Her gloved fingers trembled as she touched its edge, tracing the embroidery stitched into the corner. A crest emerged beneath her touch, unmistakable even to one who had never stood within its walls. Ravenscroft. The name alone altered the air around her, transforming coincidence into intention she could not safely ignore now. She lifted her gaze cautiously, expecting to find servants or witnesses ready to reclaim the garment and their superiority. None approached. The platform continued its restless rhythm, boots striking stone, steam dissolving into sky, conversations rising and falling without pause. Yet absence itself became its own presence. Someone had placed the cloak upon her while she hovered between consciousness and surrender. Someone had chosen not to announce their kindness. That discretion carried more power than spectacle ever could. It granted her dignity instead of replacing it. The distinction pierced her more deeply than pity ever had before. A station boy appeared at her side without warning, his cap clutched nervously between reddened hands. "Miss," he murmured, refusing to meet her eyes, "this was left for you." He extended a tin cup, steam curling upward in fragile invitation. "Tea." She hesitated, instinctively searching his face for mockery or curiosity. She found neither, only obedience. She accepted the cup slowly, feeling its warmth seep through her gloves, steadying something within her she had nearly allowed to extinguish. Kindness, when delivered without audience, possessed a sacred quality. It restored without demanding repayment, and frightened her more than cruelty ever could. Whispers followed immediately, gathering like storm clouds across the platforms in different expanse. People noticed the cloak. People noticed everything. A fallen bride could not remain invisible once marked by power. Eleanor felt their attention sharpen, curiosity transforming into calculation. Why would Ravenscroft involve himself? What interest could Duke possibly hold in disgrace? Their questions did not require answers to wound her. Speculation alone carried sufficient cruelty. She lowered her gaze, unwilling to grant them reaction. Still, beneath her restraint, confusion stirred. She had expected abandonment to conclude her story. Instead, intervention had begun something far more dangerous entirely. Hours passed beneath the watchful eye of winter's fading light. Eleanor remained seated upon the wooden bench, the cloak wrapped securely around her, unsure whether it protected her or marked her as property. The distinction mattered. Ownership, even benevolent, required surrender she could not afford. Yet warmth restored strength she had nearly forgotten. She could feel her thoughts clarifying, her breathing deepening, her body reclaiming territory lost to cold and despair. Survival, once a desperate act, began to resemble possibility. That frightened her most of all. Hope, she knew, demanded risk she had already paid dearly to survive before now. She sensed the child before she saw her, a small presence moving with deliberate courage. The girl approached without hesitation, her boots crunching softly against frost. She wore mourning black, its severity softened by youth and innocence. Her eyes held no judgment, only open curiosity that made deception impossible. "You looked very cold," she said plainly. Eleanor managed a faint smile, uncertain whether gratitude or caution should guide her response. "I was," she answered carefully. The girl nodded, as though confirming something important. "Papa says cold can make people forget they are meant to be alive." The words lingered between them, too profound for a child, too sincere to dismiss. Eleanor studied her more closely now, noting the Ravenscroft crest mirrored upon her small coat buttons. Recognition arrived quietly, accompanied by unease. "You should not speak with strangers," Eleanor said gently, hoping to protect them both from consequences neither deserved. The girl tilted her head thoughtfully. "You are not a stranger," she replied. "You are the bride everyone abandoned." The statement carried no cruelty, only truth. Eleanor felt its weight settle within her, stripping illusion from the fragile dignity she had fought to preserve. The girl extended her gloved hand without ceremony. "My name is Margaret," she announced with solemn pride. Eleanor hesitated only briefly before accepting the gesture, aware of the invisible boundary she crossed in doing so. Margaret's grip was firm, anchoring. "Where will you go now?" the child asked, her voice softened by genuine concern. Eleanor searched for an answer that would not betray her uncertainty. "Somewhere quiet," she said finally. "Somewhere I will not be seen." Margaret frowned, troubled by logic she could not accept. "Papa sees you," she replied simply, as though that fact alone altered everything now. Eleanor released her hand gently, unsettled by certainty she had not requested. Seeing her had already changed too much. It had given her warmth when she needed numbness, attention when she required invisibility. She feared its consequences more than its absence. The carriage remained where it had been, silent and patient, its occupant concealed behind frost and restraint. She told herself she would leave soon. She must. Remaining invited speculation that could destroy them both. Yet as she gathered strength to stand, the carriage door opened at last, and polished boots touched the frozen platform beside her. The man who stepped onto the platform did not arrive with theatrical urgency, nor with the brittle arrogance Eleanor had learned to expect from powerful men. He moved with measured calm, as though haste belonged to lesser concerns. His coat, black as mourning and cut with precision, fell in clean lines that suggested discipline rather than vanity. Frost gathered along the edges of his dark hair, yet he seemed unaffected by the cold that had nearly claimed her. He paused beside the carriage door, his gloved hand resting lightly against its frame, studying her without intrusion or apology whatsoever. Eleanor remained seated, the Ravenscroft cloak wrapped around her shoulders like an unanswered question. She had imagined this moment in vague, defensive shapes, expecting condescension or polite dismissal. Instead, silence stretched between them, deep and deliberate. It was not the silence of indifference. It was the silence of consideration. She became acutely aware of her appearance, of the stain she could not conceal, of the exhaustion she could not disguise. Still, she refused to lower her gaze. Whatever happened next would not find her begging. She had already lost too much to surrender pride as well today. Margaret reached for the man's hand without hesitation, her small fingers disappearing within his gloved grasp. "Papa," she said softly, as though introducing him required ceremony. He did not look down at her immediately. His attention remained fixed upon Eleanor, steady but not invasive. When he finally spoke, his voice carried quiet depth, each word deliberate. "Miss Wickham," he said, revealing knowledge she had not offered. She felt her breath falter. He knew her name, not as gossip knew it, distorted and cruel, but as fact. The distinction unsettled her more than accusation ever could tonight. "Your Grace," she replied automatically, the title emerging from habit rather than intention. It created distance between them, a barrier she hoped might protect them both. He inclined his head slightly, acknowledging her without diminishing her. "Titles matter less than truth," he said evenly. The statement lingered, difficult to interpret. Eleanor searched his face for evidence of mockery or pity. She found neither. His expression remained composed, yet something beneath it suggested restraint, as though he guarded words he had not yet earned the right to speak aloud before her now. "You have endured unnecessary hardship," he continued, his tone devoid of theatrical sympathy. It was not apology. It was recognition. Eleanor felt its weight settle within her chest, unsettling defenses she had carefully constructed. "Hardship rarely requires permission," she answered quietly. He studied her response without interruption, as though measuring its honesty rather than its defiance. Margaret leaned closer against him, her presence softening the moment's severity. "Papa does not like unnecessary things," she explained, her innocence cutting through tension. The Duke's hand rested gently upon her shoulder, anchoring himself as much as her. Eleanor became conscious of the platform's continued observation, of strangers pretending disinterest while absorbing every detail. She understood scandal when she saw it forming. "Your Grace," she said carefully, "your kindness risks becoming misinterpreted." He did not deny this. "Reputation survives interpretation," he replied calmly. "Character survives truth." She did not know how to answer. No one had spoken to her as though she possessed character worth preserving. The realization unsettled her more deeply than insult ever had. It invited dignity she feared she no longer deserved to claim for herself now. Margaret stepped forward suddenly, her courage unburdened by consequence. "Will you come inside?" she asked Eleanor plainly, gesturing toward the carriage. "It is warmer." Eleanor hesitated. Warmth had already complicated her survival. To accept more would mean acknowledging dependence she had sworn to resist. "I cannot impose further," she said gently. "You do not impose," the Duke answered before Margaret could protest. The certainty in his voice carried neither command nor plea. It carried invitation. That distinction altered everything. He did not seek ownership. He offered shelter without demanding surrender first from her. She rose carefully, aware of weakness she could not conceal. The cloak remained secure around her shoulders, its weight both burden and comfort. She approached the carriage slowly, conscious of each step as deliberate choice rather than surrender. Margaret smiled, relieved by victory she did not understand. The Duke remained beside Eleanor, neither touching nor retreating, allowing her autonomy even within his protection. The carriage interior glowed faintly, lamplight softening its dark leather surfaces. Warmth breathed outward, patient and forgiving. She paused at its threshold, aware she could still refuse without humiliation or consequence entirely. Before she entered, she turned to face him once more. "Why help me?" she asked quietly, compelled by truth she could no longer avoid. He did not answer immediately. Snow drifted between them, dissolving upon contact with warmth and presence alike. "Because abandonment leaves wounds silence cannot heal," he said at last. The words carried no performance. They belonged to memory rather than philosophy. Eleanor sensed grief within them, hidden yet undeniable. He understood loss not as observer, but as survivor. The realization unsettled her certainty that she suffered alone anymore now here. Margaret climbed inside first, her small silhouette framed by lamplight. She turned expectantly, waiting for Eleanor to follow. Eleanor hesitated only briefly before stepping forward, surrendering not dignity, but isolation. The carriage embraced her with warmth that felt almost unfamiliar. She sat opposite Margaret, conscious of distance preserved by design rather than rejection. The Duke remained outside momentarily, his profile outlined against falling snow. He seemed suspended between worlds, belonging fully to neither power nor solitude. Then he entered, closing the door with gentle finality behind them both now. Inside, silence settled differently, no longer empty but shared. Eleanor felt Margaret's curious gaze studying her without fear or judgment. "You are safe now," Margaret said simply, as though declaring fact could make it permanent. Eleanor wished she possessed such faith. Safety, she knew, often vanished without warning. The carriage began to move, its motion smooth and deliberate. She realized with sudden clarity she had crossed an invisible threshold. She was no longer merely abandoned. She was chosen to be seen. And that choice, she sensed, would change everything forever after tonight. The carriage did not travel far. Its wheels rolled only beyond the platform's reach, settling beside a narrow service road where the station's authority softened into anonymity. Eleanor felt the subtle shift immediately. This was no longer spectacle. This was refuge without audience. The Duke did not speak as the carriage came to rest, nor did he summon servants to attend them. Privacy, she realized, had been his intention from the beginning. It was not her humiliation he wished to display, but her dignity he wished to protect. The distinction unsettled her more deeply than she expected tonight. Margaret leaned against the carriage window, her breath clouding the glass with temporary constellations. "Papa does not bring strangers here," she said without accusation, only wonder. Eleanor felt the quiet weight of those words. She was not meant to belong in private spaces. Her existence had been reduced to public consequence. The Duke's presence across from her remained steady, his posture relaxed yet attentive, as though he guarded not her body, but her choice. "You are not obligated to remain," he said calmly. Freedom, offered without condition, frightened her more than confinement ever had before tonight. She studied him more closely now, freed from distance and distortion. His face carried the quiet authority of experience, its strength tempered by restraint rather than pride. Lines marked the corners of his eyes, not from laughter, but from endurance. He had suffered. That truth existed in him without announcement. "Why did you stop for me?" she asked softly, compelled by honesty she could no longer avoid. His answer did not arrive immediately. He seemed to weigh its burden carefully, as though truth itself required permission before entering the world between them here now. "Because I know what it is to arrive too late," he said at last. Eleanor felt the words settle inside her, heavy with meaning beyond their simplicity. "Too late for what?" she asked quietly. He lowered his gaze briefly, not in weakness, but in remembrance. "My wife believed herself unloved when she died," he replied. The confession emerged without adornment. "I allowed silence to speak in my place, and silence betrayed us both." Eleanor sensed no self-pity in him, only accountability. It made his kindness feel less like charity and more like atonement, honestly. Margaret listened without fully understanding, her small fingers tracing idle patterns along the seat beside Eleanor. "Papa does not like silence anymore," she said gently. Eleanor felt the truth of that observation resonate within the man across from her. Silence had once been his shield. Now it had become his regret. "I did not intend to involve you in my history," he continued carefully. Eleanor shook her head faintly. "You did not involve me," she answered. "You saw me." The distinction carried fragile significance neither of them dismissed. Seeing required courage most people never possessed at all. Outside, snow continued its quiet descent, softening edges of a world built upon judgment. Eleanor felt warmth surrounding her, not only from the carriage, but from presence that demanded nothing she could not freely give. Yet she understood consequences weighted beyond this moment. "Your Grace," she said carefully, "your protection will not remain private. People will invent reasons. They will stain your name with mine." He did not flinch. "Reputation is a fragile inheritance," he replied. "It does not define the man who carries it." She wished she believed such certainty herself tonight. Margaret shifted closer suddenly, her small shoulder brushing Eleanor's arm with unconscious trust. Eleanor stiffened instinctively, unaccustomed to innocent affection. Margaret did not withdraw. She simply remained, her presence steady and unafraid. "You are not frightening," Margaret said plainly. Eleanor felt unexpected warmth rise within her chest, fragile and dangerous. Children, she realized, recognize truth without permission from society. "Why are you not afraid of me?" Eleanor asked gently. Margaret considered this with serious thought. "Because Papa is not afraid of you," she answered simply, settling something unspoken between them both now. The Duke watched this exchange quietly, his expression unreadable yet unmistakably affected. Eleanor sensed conflict within him, not about her worth, but about what acknowledging it might cost. Society would not forgive deviation from expectation. Power survived through obedience to invisible rules. To defend her publicly would invite scrutiny he had spent a lifetime controlling. "You should not risk yourself for me," she said softly. It was not protest, but concern. He met her gaze directly. "Risk is measured by consequence," he replied. "Some consequences deserve acceptance without regret or apology ever." The carriage fell silent once more, but this silence differed from the one he had described with such regret. This silence did not wound. It allowed truth space to breathe. Eleanor realized she no longer wished to disappear. The thought frightened her. Survival had been easier when invisibility promised safety. Now, visibility offered something far more dangerous. Possibility. She studied Margaret's small hand resting beside her own, the unspoken invitation it represented. She did not reach for it. Not yet. Some gestures carried weight beyond intention. She feared breaking something neither understood fully tonight. The Duke shifted slightly, his attention returning to Eleanor with renewed clarity. "Miss Wickham," he said quietly, "you may remain under my protection as long as you wish." The offer arrived without ornament, stripped of obligation or demand. Eleanor felt its gravity immediately. Protection, freely given, carried implications society would never ignore. She searched his face for expectation. She found none, only resolve. Margaret looked between them, her expression bright with sudden realization. She leaned toward Eleanor, her voice barely louder than breath. "You do not have to wait anymore," she whispered now. Morning arrived with merciless clarity. The snow had ceased, but its presence remained, layered across the station roofs and carriage roads like the quiet aftermath of a battle no one publicly acknowledged. Eleanor Wickham stood once more beneath the iron arch of Blackthorn Station, though she no longer wore the posture of abandonment. The Ravenscroft cloak remained around her shoulders, its warmth now familiar, yet its meaning unsettled her more deeply with each passing moment. Protection had been offered freely, yet freedom itself demanded she decide whether she possessed the courage to accept it entirely now. She had insisted upon returning. The Duke had not argued. That, more than persuasion, revealed the truth of his character. He would not cage her beneath kindness, even if release invited her disappearance. Margaret had watched her with solemn concern as she stepped down from the carriage, her small hand lingering in Eleanor's grasp until distance made separation unavoidable. "Papa will still see you," she had said with certainty untouched by doubt. Eleanor carried those words now like fragile glass, terrified they might shatter beneath the weight of reality and consequence surrounding her fragile heart. The platform stirred with early travelers, their movements purposeful, their expressions sharpened by routine. Yet recognition spread swiftly. She saw it in the subtle hesitation of strangers, in the concealed glances that lingered too long. News traveled faster than trains. Ravenscroft had been seen beside her. That fact alone had transformed her from discarded scandal into dangerous rumor. She felt a shift immediately. Yesterday, she had been invisible. Today, she had become a question. And questions, she knew, often demanded answers she was not yet prepared to give aloud before everyone watching her. A gentleman near the ticket office leaned toward his companion, his voice low but deliberate. "He keeps her now. I am certain of it." The companion nodded with cold satisfaction. Dukes indulge in many weaknesses. Eleanor did not react outwardly. She had learned endurance in its purest form. Still, the words struck with familiar precision. Protection carried cost. His reputation had already begun to bleed because of her presence. She had feared this outcome, and now it unfolded exactly as expected. Love, she believed, had always demanded sacrifice. She simply had not realized whose sacrifice it would become. She moved toward the platform's edge, her steps slow but deliberate. Leaving would be simple. A train departed within the hour, its destination irrelevant, so long as it carried her beyond his reach. Disappearance would restore his safety. He would recover. Society forgave powerful men easily when temptation removed itself. She told herself this was mercy. Yet as she approached the iron boundary overlooking endless track, her chest tightened with unfamiliar resistance. She had spent her life being left. Now she faced the unbearable task of leaving someone who had chosen to see her when no one else would. The carriage arrived before she reached the ticket window. She recognized its presence without needing to turn. Ravenscroft authority altered the air itself, commanding attention without announcement. She closed her eyes briefly, gathering strength she did not possess. He had come himself, not a servant, not a message. Him. She turned slowly. The Duke stepped onto the platform, his gaze fixed upon her with quiet certainty that dissolved every fragile lie she had constructed to justify her escape. He did not rush. He did not hesitate. He simply came to stand before her, equal in vulnerability and resolve. "You intend to leave," he said gently. It was not accusation. It was truth spoken aloud. Eleanor could not deny it. "Yes," she answered, her voice steady despite the fracture within her. "It is the only way to protect you." He studied her carefully, as though measuring the cost of her courage. "Protection purchased through absence is still loss," he replied quietly. She felt the words strike deeper than any cruelty she had endured. She had convinced herself sacrifice was strength. Yet here he stood, refusing to accept protection that required her disappearance from his life forever now. Margaret appeared beside him, her small face pale with distress she could not conceal. "You promised you would not vanish," she said, her voice trembling with fragile betrayal. Eleanor felt her resolve weaken instantly. "I promised nothing," she whispered, though the words tasted false even as she spoke them. Margaret stepped forward, her hand reaching for Eleanor's cloak. "Papa does not look at anyone the way he looks at you," she said simply. Eleanor met the Duke's gaze then, searching for denial he did not offer. Instead, she found truth laid bare without defense. "I cannot allow you to suffer because of me," Eleanor said finally, her voice breaking beneath the weight of everything she feared to hope. He stepped closer, closing the distance she had tried to preserve. "Suffering is not always cruelty," he replied. "Sometimes it is the price of refusing regret." She felt her breath falter as his words dismantled the careful prison she had built around her heart. He was not protecting her out of obligation. He was choosing her despite consequence. That realization frightened her more than abandonment ever had. Choice demanded she choose in return. Margaret's small hand slipped into Eleanor's trembling fingers, anchoring her between past and future. Eleanor looked down at the child, then back at the man who had refused silence when it mattered most. She understood then that leaving would not restore the life she had lost. It would only create another wound neither of them deserved. Her fear did not vanish, but something stronger rose beside it. She tightened her grip on Margaret's hand, her voice barely louder than breath. "I do not wish to disappear," she confessed. And in that fragile confession, everything changed forever.